Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Zeidman Lecture. I'm Brian Garman, head of school at Sidwell Friends School, and this is one of the great honors that I have is to host this event along with the Zeidmans every year. Let us begin, if we can, with a moment of shared silence, please. Thank you. So this is the 43rd time that we've done this, and we've heard from really remarkable politicians and scholars, journalists, and tonight we celebrate this wonderful tradition with someone who is a terrific public intellectual and author, and someone we've been trying to get here for many years. I'd ask us, in addition to having the brief moment that we just had, which is part of the Quaker tradition, I'd ask us to hold in the light the memories of some very important people. One, of course, is John Zeidman, for whom the program is named and for whom this lecture is held in his honor, and also Nancy, his mother, who was a remarkable advocate for the program and for Sidwell Friends School more broadly. And I'd like us to include someone else to remember this year as well. I'd like us to include in our thoughts Ginger Newmeyer, a close friend of the Zeidmans and companion of Phil, who accompanied the family on its first trip to China. This is a bit of a family reunion. It's a family reunion for the Zeidmans, it's a family reunion for the Newmeyers, and so many of you have been coming to this event for so many years. We usually have it in March. We have it early this year. Zeidman season is early this year, and we're so glad you could join us for it. So if we could hold those friends in the light and just express some gratitude for their legacy. Thank you. We lost Ginger last spring, but her legacy, as well as that of her former husband, Jimmy Newmeyer, endures in the Newmeyer Awards, which we've been giving for 50 years at Sidwell Friends for volunteer service. And so I'm delighted to announce this evening that tomorrow, actually we'll be announcing the Zeidman Awards, but tonight I'm announcing that Betsy Zeidman, a member of the class of 1976, will be among the folks who have won the Zeidman Award. So a long overdue recognition. Betsy, the whole plan was to hold this till the 50th, right? So we're delighted that you're with us here this evening and that Jennifer is with us and Phil as well. Thank you for being part of this special evening. And please join me in thanking the Zeidmans for the remarkable gift that they've given to Sidwell Friends. I'd also like to recognize the members of the Zeidman Program Advisory Committee. So if those folks could stand, we have a group that keeps us abreast of all things China. Here's two over here. And where's Charlie? Charlie will be joining us later. We had Ginger. There's Charlie. Charlie, you're not off the hook. So yeah, great. And I want to especially thank Charlie for making the connection to Peter. We've been trying to get Peter here for many years, and Charlie finally figured out how to do it, and we had to change the date, but we're so glad that we did, and that all of you are with us here this evening. Peter gave some wonderful remarks today also to the upper school students, and he was surrounded by the students after talking to them a little about what it means to be an author, and what it means to think deeply about other areas of the world and to do it with as much honesty and authenticity that one is able to do. And what Peter once wrote about the Peace Corps speaks to what I always hope that the Zeidman program will give to our students. And Peter was just lamenting that the Peace Corps program was closed in China in 2020, but he was there in the late 90s, right? That you were, was it 96 to 98 that you were there? And which actually corresponds exactly with Chi Wei. Chi Wei, our acting director, said that's when she grew up in China. And Peter, she said, your books are absolutely on target with her experience in China. So Chi Wei might have something to share with us about that later. But Peter wrote this about the Peace Corps. He wrote, Peace Corps is probably the only government entity that taught Americans to abandon key national characteristics: pride, ambition, impatience, the instinct to control, the desire to accumulate, the missionary impulse. All of it slipped away in the Peace Corps. What replaced it, perhaps, is the ethos that Peter developed as a writer. He is, above all, a careful and compassionate listener, one who conveys truth with great nuance and heartfelt respect for the inherent dignity of each person. Peter, I just want to say thank you for letting your life speak in that way and such a profound and deep way to help us build the same kind of understanding that we seek the Zeidman program to build. So thank you for that. It's such an honor to have you for that reason. The Zeidman program has a similar distinguished mission, I would argue. Born of a courageous vision, the program traces its origins back to 1979, the commencement of 1979, when Nancy and Phil Zeidman told their son that they had organized a group of 20 people to go to China. And Charlie, you were on that trip too, I believe. Is that right? Again, this is a big reunion, this event is. The experience was life-altering for John and for the Zeidman family and ultimately for our school. After graduating from upper school, John matriculated to Duke University, and I hope there was someone here who approached me earlier who said that she was a friend of John's from Duke, and I hope you'll come up and say hello to the Zeidmans if you haven't already. She did, good. But sadly, when he went back to China to study in 1981, he contracted encephalitis and passed away a year later. Nancy and Phil established the John Fisher Zeidman program in Chinese studies in his honor, ensuring that John's legacy as a teacher would live in perpetuity. His openness, courage, and foresight continue to inspire our students here today. And it inspires them to think about international conflict with an eye toward peace and to deepen understanding through cultural exchange. We are extremely proud of this program, in which more than 180 students, nearly a quarter of the students who are enrolled in language classes at Sidwell Friends, study Mandarin. This is really extraordinary when you think about the declension in Mandarin programs across the United States. There was a big outgrowth of Mandarin programs about 10 years ago in high schools. You're not seeing that as frequently. It's because it's really hard. It's challenging language to learn. But we're very fortunate that our students remain very dedicated to studying the language. And we owe the success of the program to our wonderful teachers. So if you're involved with the Chinese Studies program, would you please stand so we can all recognize you? Really wonderful teachers, very dedicated and very inventive. And Chi-Wei, I want to thank you especially for leading the program over this past year. I'd also like to recognize the longest serving director of the Chinese Studies program, who's here, John Flower, Dr. Flower. Where's Dr. Flower? Over here. And the founding director of the program, Lucia Pierce, who is over here. Thanks to our teachers and to people like John and Lucia, our language program has achieved yet another national recognition. In November, the Sidwell Friends Chinese program received a National Outstanding K-16 Chinese Program Award at the annual meeting of the Chinese Language Association of Secondary and Elementary Schools. 12 schools were recognized for their excellence in curriculum innovation, student learning, and community engagement. Class commended Sidwell Friends for being one of the first American high schools to offer a comprehensive Chinese language education. That's one of the things we're very proud of. In announcing the award, the chair of the class membership said, spanning grades 4 to 12, the program at Sidwell Friends integrates language, history, and experiential learning through a mission-based curriculum rooted in Quaker values such as peace, integrity, community, equality, and sustainability. Students explore China through classroom study, exchanges with sister schools in Beijing and Shanghai, fieldwork opportunities, which was kind of the hallmark of Dr. Flower's time here, and collaboration with various American and Chinese institutions. Sidwell students have earned national recognition in speech, writing, and research competitions, using the school's Quaker values to foster cross-cultural understanding and global citizenship. I'm pleased to report that just last week we had a delegation here from our sister school at Fudan University. There were 8 students here and several teachers and administrators that paired with some of our students who were studying Chinese, and then we had 2 students who were taking a gap year in China who came back to host the teachers. So it was really a great connection here at the school. So friends, the state of the Zeidman program remains very strong. We're very grateful for it. And to help us celebrate this evening, I'd like to ask our volunteer extraordinaire, Betsy Zeidman, who is also the mother of a Sidwell Friends graduate. I'd like her to introduce this evening's lecture. Betsy, thank you for the remarkable legacy that you and your family have given to the school. We're grateful for everything that you do and continue to do for us.
Thank you, Brian, for those lovely remarks and for everything you do to steward the program at this school. You also made a comment about the fact that the program, we're doing this earlier than usual this year. I actually think it's somewhat kismet because we're doing it on Chinese New Year. So Lucia told me earlier, I think you say Qin Nian Kuai Le. I have no idea if that's right. But so I have the honor of introducing Peter Hessler, who, as was said earlier, we've been trying to get here for quite a while, so it's a treat to have him. Peter is a writer of narrative nonfiction, a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, and the author of 6 books. He was originally from Columbia, Missouri, but spent most of his writing life overseas. In 1996, as Brian mentioned earlier, he joined the Peace Corps, which sent him to Fuling, where he taught English and American literature at Fuling Teachers College. And then he stayed in China until 2007, period of dramatic change in China. He eventually described all of that change in 3 books, Rivertown, Oracle Bones, and Country Driving. In 2011, he moved his family to Cairo for a new experience, where he covered Arab Spring, which led to the book The Buried. He was also a contributing writer for National Geographic. In 2019, he moved back to China, to Chengdu, which is actually where my daughter was born, so it plays quite close to my heart. He taught there, he taught students again, and I think going back after 2 decades, it was a radically different place, and much of that was described in his latest book, Other Rivers. He also had a very different perspective when he went back, because at that point he had his 2 daughters who were part of that school, Ariel and Natasha, who are here today with their mother, Leslie, who's also a writer in her own right. I don't know where, oh, they're back in the back. So thank you all for being here. Peter has won many awards, including the Kiriyama Prize, the National Book Award. He's been a finalist, National Magazine Award. He's been a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He was a Rhodes Scholar and a MacArthur Fellow. But to me, what's most notable about Peter is that when he writes about China, his focus is less on the people at the top and the people in charge than on the everyday people, the people that are working and living. And it's the ordinary people. He provides us an access to understand what it's like living there. It reminds me a bit of a letter that my brother John wrote home when he was in China 40-some years ago. He was talking about the journalists who were covering China. And he said, I think it would be helpful if some of these reporters left their apartments occasionally. Which I think, when I think back on it, is rather perceptive of someone who was 19 or 20 years old at the time. I think Peter is one of those reporters who left his apartment a lot and has told us a lot of stories about life in China and in other places. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your stories.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here tonight. And I'm especially happy to be doing this in memory of John Zeidman, who was of a generation of people, young people going to China. He was a generation before me, and I sort of recognize what that cohort was like. Not very different from when we went as well in the Peace Corps. People tended to be adventurous, they tended to be curious, they tended to be open. It wasn't a place you went for material gain. You didn't go there necessarily because you were ambitious. And it was sort of a special moment. I'm very honored to be part of this legacy. I went, as you mentioned, in the Peace Corps. So 1996 was when I went to live in China. And the Peace Corps, which no longer exists in China, was in some ways an unusual thing that this program ever happened. And it took them a long time to get it going. The US was very enthusiastic about sending volunteers to China. The Chinese were much less enthusiastic about it in the early years. Partly because during the Mao years, the Peace Corps had been often the target of propaganda. The Chinese state media would say that the Peace Corps was a propaganda organization, that they took idealistic young Americans and sent them to the developing world to try to make it capitalist, which is kind of true. The Peace Corps was a product of the Cold War, and it was very much a soft power initiative. And it was tied up with the tensions with the Soviet Union, and the Chinese were, of course, very aware of this. And one way that they got around this, when they finally let the Peace Corps in, was to change the name. In Chinese, it was Hepingdui, was Peace Corps, and that word was tainted, and so they just started to call us the Meizhong Youhao Zhiyuanzhi, the U.S.-China Friendship Volunteers. In some ways, it was a very Chinese solution, very pragmatic. So I was part of the third group to be sent there, 1996. This is a picture of my cohort after we arrived in Beijing in the summer of 1996. Very small group. In those days, the Chinese didn't want too many people coming at once. They weren't sure if they were really comfortable with having us there. And again, this was a time when it was very unusual for Americans to go to China and even to think about China. Of that group, none of us had studied Chinese. So totally different from the students you have here, where so many students are learning Mandarin. None of us had studied Chinese. I think none of us had even taken a class in Chinese history or politics. Two of the volunteers had never been on an airplane before. And we had a couple others who had never been out of the country. So, it was a big shock to all of us. And we were sent to Sichuan province, which is in the southwest of China. Let me see if I've got the clicker here. You can see, so I'm not sure if this is working. Anyway, Sichuan is sort of a landlocked province deep in the interior. At that time, it had a population of about 130 million, mostly rural. It had been quite poor. And one of the main reasons that we were sent there was because it was Deng Xiaoping's home province. And the Americans knew that if they sent the volunteers to Deng Xiaoping's home country, that it would appeal to the Chinese. So that was one of the reasons we were there. And we were sent to small teachers' colleges all around the province. So there was, at this time, China was trying to engage more with the outside world, and part of that was to teach English. And in order to do that, they needed more English teachers. And so we were all sent to teachers' colleges to train young Chinese to become teachers of English and then go back to rural middle schools and high schools and teach the next generation of Chinese. I was sent to this small town called Fuling, which is on the Yangtze River, along with another volunteer named Adam Meyer. Both of us were young, in our 20s. Neither of us knew anything about China. And our students, most of them had studied Chinese for 7 or 8 years without ever meeting a native speaker, much less an American. So there was intense exchange of cultural in the first semester in particular. And I learned a lot from their writings. They were often very nervous to speak with us, and their spoken Chinese was often poor, but they wrote beautifully. And I was fortunate to teach writing class and literature class, so I saw a lot of their voices through the way they wrote. The first semester, I had a student named Richard who was quite bright, and he submitted an essay to my writing class that the title was, "Why Americans Are So Casual." And Richard wrote in this essay, "I'm a Chinese. As we all know, the Chinese nation is a rather conservative nation. So many of us have conservative thinking in some degree. I don't know whether it is bad or good. Our foreign language teachers, Peter and Adam, came to teach us this term. It provides a good opportunity of understanding the American way of life. In my opinion, they are more casual than us Chinese people. Why do I think so? I'll give you some facts to explain this. For example, when Mr. Hessler is having class, he can scratch himself casually without paying attention to what others may say. He dresses up casually, usually with his belt dangling, dropping and dangling. But to tell you the truth, it isn't considered a good manner in China, especially in old people's eyes. In my opinion, I think it's very natural. Last week, when Miss Thompson, another Peace Corps volunteer, gave us a lecture on the American election, she took off her woolen sweater and tied it to her waist. To us Chinese people, it's almost unimaginable. But thanks goodness, we major in English and know something about America. It didn't surprise us. But if other people saw this, they can't believe their own eyes. So this was a very different era. There's a picture there. Halfway through my time in the Peace Corps, the end of our first year was when Hong Kong returned to China, June 30th of 1997. And you can see all the students there at midnight were in the classroom watching this tiny television in the corner. So in those days, it was quite, most of our students had come from the countryside. Almost none of them had families with any educational background. I think the majority of them had parents who were illiterate. So we talk about first generation students here. In this case, these were first generation, even in terms of literacy. All of them were majoring in English. It was extremely unusual, of course, to go to university at that time. Only 1 out of every 12 college-age Chinese, 8%, would be able to do that at that time. So when you look at the way people classify higher education, there were sort of 3 stages of it: elite, mass, and universal. And China was at the elite stage, which means that only the elite would make it into college. These are pictures that before I left, one of the things that I did is I asked them to give me their addresses, and many of them also submitted their pictures. And even getting a picture at this time was sort of a big thing. None of these students had cameras. It was very uncommon for Chinese to have a camera. Then there were 2 photographers who worked on campus, and they would take pictures if students wanted them. They were always around, and the students would pay them like about a kwai for a photograph. And as I said, most of them, at the time they had been born in '74, the population was overwhelmingly rural, 83% rural. And these were some of the pictures they posted. The boy on the right is Jimmy, wearing the Chicago Bulls jersey, which was very common in that period because of Michael Jordan. Kathy was in the middle. The boy on the left was our class monitor, or banjiang. He was a Communist Party member, and he sort of organized the class. And his name was Mo, his English name. Each of the students had chosen an English name. A couple things you notice about Mo is he has this sort of oversized suit jacket that many men wore at that time with the tailor's label on the sleeve. It's also interesting because Mo is actually a non-smoker. And he just borrowed the cigarette. He said it was too expensive to smoke, so he never took up the habit. But he borrowed the cigarette because, in pictures of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, they often had cigarettes. So the boys sometimes emulated that. Adam and I were both given full Chinese names with Chinese family names. And at a certain point, some of the students thought that this was not fair because they had single English names. So I had a student named Willie, who I suddenly began to receive papers from Willie Foster. And then it was William Jefferson Foster. And I had another student named George who became George Baker Frost. And I gave them no guidance on those names, but they had this instinct for very good waspy names. And Mo actually became Mo Money, was his full English name. And you would sort of, in this day, you would kind of memorize the students in the early days actually by their outfits, because people had so few possessions, and it was very hard to wash your clothes. They had to wash them by hand in the dormitories in cold water, and so they would wear the same thing every day. And when I first memorized, it wasn't just faces I was memorizing, it was also what they wore. You would see Jimmy with that Bulls jersey all the time. You're very aware, I think, as a teacher of the physicality of your students, and especially, I think, at that time. We were in a pretty small classroom, and it was not heated or air-conditioned, so you felt the weather. And one thing that I noticed, of course, was that the students were not very tall. I mean, if you look in that picture, I'm towering over most of them. These rural Chinese generally were undersized, often had not been fed very well. In the winter, they would often have chilblains on their hands and on their ears, something I had not really seen before because conditions were cold, even though it's not really that cold in Sichuan, but nothing was ever heated, and they're around cold water a lot. But at the same time, you had a sense that they were on their way to becoming something different. When you entered college, your hukou, or household registration, automatically switched to urban from rural. So they were officially becoming city people. This is a picture from a Christmas party our first year, and the kids wore their best clothes. And they sort of, when you see them in this light, you could see where they were going. The boy on the right was named Yangtze, was his English name, which was, in his case, it was a translation of his Chinese Biming, his poet name. Yangtze was a really handsome, charismatic boy, not a great student, partly because he spent a lot of time chasing girls in the Chinese department. That was why he wrote poetry as well. And North was the other Banjiang, the other class monitor, also a Communist Party member. And they chose these students, it wasn't really necessarily because they were really politically active or engaged in communism. It was often just the kids who were really good, reliable, who were good at organizing things and were calm, trustworthy. And so that was North. He had taken his English name from Frederick North, the Earl of Guilford, who he had read about in a history textbook that had been a prime minister in Britain. And he liked also because north is the direction of authority in China, Beijing. I don't think that book told him that prime minister was the one that lost the American provinces. But they had both Yangtze and North were the first from their village to go to college, which was very common for these students. Most of them had grown up on farms that were maybe a half of an acre or less, terraced rice farming. This picture here was right outside the back gates of the college. We were surrounded by the countryside in those days. So we definitely had a sense of the background of these students, but at the same time, there's a lot of things we didn't understand that we didn't learn until later. I had a student named David who wrote me in 2017, 20 years after I had taught him, and he apologized for not having been a very good student. I don't think in America you get too many letters from people 20 years later apologizing for not studying hard enough. And he hadn't been a bad student. I just remembered that he had been a little low energy and sometimes fell asleep in class. And when he wrote me, he said, for 3 years, I did not eat and sleep well. I remember in 1996, for half a year, I just had 1 meal a day. I was a sad man. But now I'm happy about my life. So I realized this poor kid had been malnourished. He was suffering. There are many things like that we didn't learn until later. You didn't learn a lot about the recent past. I mean, their parents had been a generation that had experienced the Great Leap Forward, the terrible famine in China, 1958 to 61, and of course the Cultural Revolution. And sometimes when they wrote about their families, these things would be referred to very obliquely, but rarely in much detail. And they often said, my parents won't talk about that. One of the few students I had who had come from the city was a student named Emily. She had named herself after Emily Bronte. And she was probably my best student from that cohort. And her father was actually a brilliant mathematician, was a professor at the university. So she was different from most of the other kids. She wrote about her parents in that first semester. When my parents were of my age, the whole country was in a great confusion. Politics went first. Intellectuals were said to have the tendency to follow capitalism, so they were assigned to basic units to accept reformation. My father was one of them. In the following 8 years after he graduated from Sichuan University, he worked in a small coal mine. Actually, he was luckier than most in that when he was sent to this place, the people there respected him, and they sort of valued the fact that he could help them balance their books and do some of the work, the sort of more clerical work in the mine. So his experience wasn't so terrible. But his sister's family had it worse. They were sent to another small area where the father was repeatedly attacked as an intellectual and paraded through town in these sort of Maoist rallies, and he eventually died young. And because of that, his sons, who were Emily's cousins, were not able to go to school beyond even into high school. And her cousin, who was really quite bright, ended up living with Emily's family and working as a gardener on campus. So you had a sense of the history and the turmoil that it had created and these different paths. Emily and her 2 siblings went to college. Her cousin was a gardener. She wrote once, "I don't know much about the history of my cousin's family because he and his brothers never talk about it. My father sometimes says something, but he is far from a good storyteller. So what I know are only some fragments. And when my father tries to start a conversation, my cousins say, 'It's the history,' and stop at that. Never have I heard them complain about the past." So there was very little sense of the recent past. There was also a very strong sense of geographical isolation. Fuling was at the junction of the Yangtze River and the Wu River. You can see in the second picture, the Yangtze's coming from the right, from the west, and the Wu River comes in from the south. One thing you notice, these are all pictures I took in the 90s. Often the sky has that very gray color. It was heavily polluted in those days. There was a lot of industry in downtown Fuling that was poorly regulated. You can also see on the river there a lot of life. There's a lot of boats, docks. That was our main transport. We had no highway. There was no railroad. The nearest big city was Chongqing, and if you went there on the ferry, which was the way that you went, it was 8 hours upstream. So you were very much felt isolated, surrounded by the countryside. The population, 185,000. That's pretty small in those days. This is a view of the city looking down onto the Yangtze River during winter. One thing you can see from this picture, if you look, the city's on this steep hillside, and you can see on the upper parts of the city, the buildings, there's a lot of white buildings. So this is new construction. So the sort of economic boom that had already started down in southern China and in Shanghai, it was starting to happen in Fuling. New construction was happening around the city, but not everywhere. If you look at the bottom of that city, you can see there's a line of sort of brown buildings, like a band at the very bottom near the river. That's because we were in the Three Gorges region where the dam was being constructed downstream. So our town was pretty far upstream. It was not going to be totally flooded, but those lower areas were going to had to be destroyed. So none of that was being rebuilt or improved. And so when you went down into the lower parts of the city, everything was just kind of deteriorating. And it was interesting because as you traveled down the river, downstream, that band got higher and higher in each city. And eventually you got to cities where they were going to have to move the entire thing. And in those places, nothing was being improved. So you did have this sense of a massive change that was about to happen to this region. When you would walk through Fuling, you periodically saw these signs. And that was the water line of the future reservoir. I was there until 1998, and the dam the first stage was going to be completed in 2003, so it wasn't really that far away. But again, this was something that people rarely talked about. A little bit the same as the recent past, but also the future was also not something that people spent a lot of energy on. They were very much focused on the challenges of that moment. There was so much going on, there were already so many things that had changed that they didn't really talk much or worry about this. So in those days, the river would drop in the winter. And when it dropped, you could see that line of green that's been exposed below the city. So that would be flooded in summer. And there was also a strip of sandstone. You can see there in the middle of the river, there's a very thin strip of stone. That would appear. That was called Bai Heliang, the White Crane Ridge. And every winter, that ridge would appear. And back in ancient times, boatsmen had started to use that as a gauge, because if you were going downstream, the most dangerous time was winter, because the rapids in the Three Gorges would be treacherous. And so a boatsman could stop at that rock and kind of gauge the level of the water, and he'd know what to expect downstream. So at some point in the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century, somebody carved 2 fish in that stone, and people began to use that as the gauge. And then they began to make inscriptions about that, and they would talk about when it appeared. So the first dated inscription was from 763 in the Tang Dynasty. And that picture there is from January 30th, 1998, and the water level on that day was 2 inches higher than it had been in 763. So you had a very strong sense of the continuity. And it was a beautiful piece of archaeology, because over the centuries, many officials in Fuling had inscribed calligraphy in it. And often very literate people had been posted there. And they wrote poetry, sometimes they inscribed pictures. More than 300,000 characters were carved into that rock. And it was great to go out there because nobody ever went there. It was, you know, it was not hard to get to, but Fuling was not a tourist destination. There was usually a fishing family. You can see the boat in the foreground. So in the winter, they would park their boat there, and they'd pick up anybody who wanted to go out there. And I think it was about 25 cents to go out there. You can kind of see on the rock, there's a guy waving. His name was Huang Dejian, and he had been posted out there by the Antiquities Bureau. And his job was to monitor the site. He'd wear this People's Liberation Army heavy coat. You know, it's always freezing out there. But he knew everything about the characters. So if you went there with Huang Dejian, and I had a book that I'd bought in town that talked about the various poets and calligraphers, and if I was interested in one of them, he would go and show me where it was. But of course, the question was, what would happen? The water was going to rise about 150 feet. And so what would happen to this, you know, remarkable, artifact? My last year in Fuling, this story appeared in the Chongqing paper under the headline, "The White Crane Ridge Inscriptions Protection Plan to be Determined." I used to read the paper for my Chinese class, and I brought this one in to talk to with my tutors who were from the Chinese department. And they talked about in this story, there were two possible solutions. One was to build an underwater museum. And the other solution was to make a rubbing of each of these carvings and then build some kind of exhibition hall where you could see them. And I talked about this with my tutor, and he's like, "This is absurd. They're not going to build an underwater museum." You know, the Fuling didn't even have a stoplight. There was no traffic light in the whole city at that time. The only person that I knew who believed it was Huang Dejian, who was the guy who sat on the rock wearing the PLA overcoat. And I figured that he was probably, you know, pretty wistful thinking in that position. And they estimated that if it was buried by the river in about, they said that all of those 12 centuries worth of carvings would be rubbed away in about 10 years. So I left Fuling in 1998. I was fortunate that pretty quickly I was posted to Beijing to be, of course, to start out as a freelance writer and eventually becoming a foreign correspondent. So that allowed me to stay in close touch with my students. Again, I told you I gathered all of their addresses, which was very fortunate, because in those days there were no cell phones, nobody was on the internet, and the only way to communicate was by letter, by hand. And I would send out, every 6 months, I would send out about more than 100 letters to my former students, and they would write back. You can see some of these are addressed to the Wall Street Journal, where I worked as an assistant. And these were young people in their 20s. Most of them were teaching in small towns. They were often a little bit lonely, and they shared details about their lives. And this was how we sort of built this communication over time. Like most rural Chinese, they tended to marry young, and a lot of the early letters I had were about their courtships and their marriage. In January 21st of 2000, a student wrote, "I'm working in a small village. As you know, I can't make more money as a teacher in China. But I feel very happy because my students here all respect me and like me very much. Maybe I will have a girlfriend next year. She is not pretty and beautiful, but she is very kind to me." That same year in December, another student wrote, one of his classmates, "Last winter, I was married with a doctor. He is not very handsome, but he is very kind to me. Next spring, we will have a baby." November 15th, 2004, a student named Rex wrote, "What makes me happy is that I married an ugly woman who graduated from the math department of Fuling Teachers College." April 22nd of 2000, a student named DJ, who was a real character, wrote a long letter. He said, "After graduating Fuling Teachers College, my parents and relatives all wanted to introduce girlfriends to me. Some were also very beautiful, but when they saw me, they at once went away and left a word. The toad wants to eat the meat of the swan. Now I find a girlfriend finally. She will be my wife after 2000. She isn't beautiful. There are many black points on her face. But I love her because she has more money than me. Maybe I love her money more. I have many things to say, but I can't write out. This letter is typed from my girlfriend's computer." I always thought this characteristic was kind of, to me, it was very distinctly rural Chinese, and part of it is modesty. is that you never want to take too much pleasure in something. Even when the students had a girlfriend, if they showed you a picture, Adam and I would always say, oh, she's very beautiful. They say, no, no, she's ugly. They had to say that. And the same thing later when people would have a child, you'd say, oh, the child, he's very smart. No, he's stupid. And it's also a little bit like, almost like the Middle Eastern evil eye, in that there's a bit of a fear that if you take too much pleasure in something, it attracts misfortune. So this was the way. I mean, I don't think they all believed that their spouses were that ugly, but that was certainly the way they had to talk. So we built up this communication over time, and it was a really big part of my life as a foreign correspondent. I wrote about it a lot, and I would go down and visit them, and it sort of helped me keep me grounded in China, and to have this group of people to be in touch with over time was a really special thing. Also, we developed a high level of trust because they read everything that I wrote, and we had known each other for so long. So after a number of years, I started to give them surveys where I would ask them questions so I could get sort of more detailed and sometimes quantifiable information about their lives. One of the things I often asked them about was money, what their salaries were like. When they started teaching, most of them made about $500 a year. When I surveyed them in 2014, that had risen to nearly $18,000. In 2021, the median household income was $35,000. And then it was up a little bit the last time I surveyed them to $37,000. So you can see sort of the significant improvement in the lives of these people who by the time that I was coming back and visiting them in 2019 to 2021, they were definitely, you would describe them as middle-class urban Chinese. This is one of the times when Adam and I went back for a visit. And you can see they very much look like urban middle-class people, and there's Mo Money there on the left with his iPhone. It was interesting looking back because, in many ways they had no advantages. Obviously, they had no educational background in their families. They certainly were not from an important part of the country. But their advantage was historical. They were lucky in terms of their timing. They were born right around the time when Mao Zedong died, which meant that they grew up with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. And so they could kind of ride those changes. And you could see this in their outcomes. And of course, this happened all across China. More than 1 billion Chinese moved new to the cities after the reforms, and about 800 million escaped poverty. These numbers are kind of meaningless, I think, when we see them from afar, but it's very different when you've followed people through this experience and you remember what it was like when they didn't have very much. One of the reasons I moved back in 2019 was to reconnect with some of these former students. North and Yangtze were two of the ones that I met up with again. There's a picture of them from 2021. And Yangtze, as I mentioned, had been one of the students who was not particularly good academically, but he was a very kind of a dynamic, charismatic kid. When he went to his teaching job, he set up a night class. He realized a lot of people were getting interested in computers. This was like 1998. So he set up an evening class where kids would pay like 2 kwai, like 25 cents, to learn to type. And he got 2 keyboards, and he'd have the keyboards at the front of the classroom, and the kids would take turns. They'd line up behind the keyboard, and he had a watch with an alarm, and after 2 minutes, he'd ring the alarm, and they'd switch places, and the next kid would come up. And this class became popular, and people were paying for it, and he was soon making more money from that than he was from his teaching job, and then, of course, the communist cadres at his school shut it down. But then the parents complained, because Chinese parents were starting to have some disposable income, and one of the things that they prioritize is education. And they said, we want our kids to be able to do this. And somebody else said, well, this is what Deng Xiaoping wants us to do. We're supposed to do business. So they let him do it. And he ended up making enough money to get a job transfer to Fuling. And then in Fuling, he borrowed $1,000 from a colleague at the school he was teaching at, and he opened a cell phone shop. And this was, again, the late 1990s. Rich people were starting to have cell phones. And he was doing pretty well. But one thing he noticed was the main thing he was selling was walkie-talkies. One of the distributors gave him some walkie-talkies, and he didn't really know why am I even stocking this? And then they were flying off the shelves, and he realized in a construction crew, you couldn't use cell phones to communicate because the workers don't have cell phones in that day. But walkie-talkies were very useful. And every time you expanded your crew, you needed more walkie-talkies, and you go back to the same shop. And he cornered the market in Fuling. He ended up opening another shop, then he opened shops in Chongqing, and he just made money hand over fist, and he began to go into other industries connected with construction. He went into parking garages and sort of alarm systems. And then he started to buy real estate. And then he went into billboards in Chongqing. When I visited him in 2021, he drove me around Fuling in his Mercedes S350, which was a car that he had paid $150,000 for. So again, this was somebody who had been the first from his village to go to college, who'd grown up near poverty. North, his classmate, the one who had been the class monitor and the Communist Party member, he found a different niche in that he was putting elevators onto buildings. You can see that building there. Especially during the Three Gorges construction, they often built buildings without elevators because they're doing things pretty quickly. And you could build a building as high as 12 stories without an elevator. And so about 10 years ago, North said, well, you know, people are getting older. They don't like walking up all these steps. China's an aging population. I think people need elevators. And so he started a business where he would attach an elevator onto the side of the building like that. Which was funny because, I mean, he's not an engineer, right? He was an English major. And so I asked him, well, how do you design an elevator? He's like, I don't do that. I have an engineer who does it. I said, my job is different. And so his job was to go and negotiate. Because when you do this, every single floor pays a different amount. The higher you are, the more you pay. And the first 2 floors don't pay anything. But as the project gets going, the people on the first 2 floors get really pissed off because everybody above them is going to see their property values go up. So he would go tell them, you know, this isn't hurting you. You don't have to pay anything for it. But they were angry because their neighbors are doing better. So then he would have to negotiate and get the people on the upper floors to pay off the people on the lower floors. So there's this very intense negotiating, of course, and he keeps in pretty good shape because he's going up and down the stairs before they get the elevator done to do this. And he had the perfect, so you realize, yeah, this is what he's made for. Like, he was the class monitor. He's really good at negotiating with people, and this is a perfect job for him. So that was one of the reasons I went back in 2019 after 20 years, was to sort of meet with these people. But I also was interested in teaching again. So it had been basically a generation since I taught before. So I went to Sichuan University and was teaching students there. Again, as I mentioned before, is 8% when I taught in 1996. By the time I went back in 2019, that figure had risen to 51.6%. So they had passed through all 3 stages of higher education in the span of a single generation. And to kind of put that in perspective, like when I left the college in Fuling in 1998, they had 2,000 students. By 2004, they had more than 20,000. They built a new campus. That happened basically at every college where Peace Corps people were stationed. So you sort of had this, this expansion on a massive scale. One of the things that really jumped out at me, I would often show the students, the new students, the picture of me in the 90s and talk about how tall I used to be. And they would laugh because now a lot of the students towered over me. In 2020, there was a study in the Lancet that out of 200 countries, China had seen the largest increase in boys' height and the 3rd largest in girls since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male is now more than 3.5 inches taller, basically because of nutrition. Those are pictures of my Fuling students with their sons, and that's often, the son is often, or the daughter, is often towering over the mother. There's also a very different relationship to the past. One thing that really struck me was this younger cohort of students, when they wrote about their parents, they had a lot of stories. Their parents told them a lot about what their lives were like. I had a boy named Fenton whose parents had started, his dad had started out as a taxi driver, and his mom worked in a flower company. They were kind of the same age as my Fuling students, and they succeeded and eventually opened a business where they were manufacturing plastic bags, and they did well. And they would tell him lots of stories about what it was like for them. He said, when he wrote about this once, he said, these stories have a fairly fixed and smooth pattern, which can be said to be similar to the current superhero genre films. Our childhood living conditions were not good, is always the beginning of this kind of story. In the middle is something that seems to be easy to realize now, but was difficult at that time. And you must cherish everything you have now, is always the end of these stories. So a very different relationship to the past. That earlier generation, their parents had been shaped by political events that came from Beijing, from far away. They felt like they had no control. The students I had taught in the 90s, their lives were really shaped by economic changes. And they felt like the decisions they made mattered. They had agency when they looked back. Somebody like Yangtze would say, I made the decision to open that shop. and then it took me to the next stage. So that relationship to the past was very different. I would often go back to Fuling, and the trip by then was a lot easier because they had opened a high-speed rail, and that 8 hours was reduced to 38 minutes on the high-speed rail. There were also multiple highways. I would often try to take pictures from the same vantage point. Those are pictures, and you notice one of the big differences, of course, is the air changes a lot. Another thing is the rivers are very quiet now. Very few boats. A lot of those docks and boats are gone. Nobody uses the Yangtze for transport anymore. This was a picture taken from my apartment window. I used to look out on the city, and suddenly all of these huge buildings sprouted up. I tried to go back and take pictures from the countryside, but it was almost impossible to shoot any sort of rice terrace or recognizable landscape because the landscape had changed so much. Nobody farms rice anymore, too labor intensive. And many fields have become fallow because there's pretty much no young people in the cities. I mean, no young people in the countryside. This is a shot of the Yangtze. You can see the river's wider. They built a dike on the, sort of in that lower part of town. Sometimes I would notice things that I hadn't noticed before. Like in this picture, I saw that temple on the right. And then when I looked on the left picture, I realized that there were some kind of ruins there. And I had never noticed that when I lived there in the 90s. I went down and talked to people, and they said, yeah, there used to be a Taoist temple here, and it was torn down. I assumed it was the Cultural Revolution, but actually it had been the Great Leap Forward because people had been starving, and they were just trying to find anything they could sell or barter for food. And it had been rebuilt by the time I came back. Interesting, when you go back and visit it, there was nothing on that temple to say what had happened in the past, and that's very common. The one place where they did talk about the past is when you walk along the river, they have these memorials to the old city in the 2000s during the period when it was developing fast. So they will remember the things that have more of an economic facet. When you walk along that dike, you come to a place where there's this new museum. You go into the museum and buy a ticket, and there's this escalator that goes down for 300 feet, and you go down to the bottom of the escalator, and it's like a submarine. They have these portals, and you look out on the portals, and you're looking out on the White Crane Ridge. And so it's kind of an amazing experience because I could remember, the first time I went there was in 2010, and only 12 years ago I'd stood there on that rock, and then you're looking at this thing, and it's 150 feet below the river. And this thing that seemed an absurd idea when we were there, it had actually been built at a cost of $34 billion. I went there with my friend Adam, and we met with the director of the museum, who was Huang Dejian. So the same guy that used to sit there with the PLA coat, he's not now the director of this multi-million-dollar museum, And he had like 2 cell phones, and there's pictures of him with every dignitary, who's come to visit. And to me, that was sort of characteristic, right? Because all these things that are totally unrecognizable, that you're like, I cannot believe how much this has changed, but it's the same guy there, And just the same way the students, when they write me, they're still very rural in many ways in the way they talk about their families or about themselves. So it's one of the hard things to understand in China is how has it changed, how have so many things changed so much, but other things feel like they haven't changed at all. Of course, the big one is politics. If you had asked me in the 1990s, would the political system be the same in 20 plus years, 30 years, I would have said absolutely not. It's going to definitely change because you can see the economic change. You can see the educational change. And that's not the case. And in some ways, it's more oppressive now in some respects than it was when I taught there in the 90s. And I think that's an interesting challenge, a thing to think about, because there's 2 dynamics that would seem to tell you that there's a real risk of instability. One is the inequality of wealth, which is kind of rivals the US now. The other is the rapid expansion of education. We talk about expanding the college from 2,000 to 20,000. That's a pretty dangerous thing to do, actually, if you're an authoritarian government, right? Even if you're not an authoritarian government, it often leads to change. South Korea did that in the late 50s and early 1960s, and it definitely contributed to student movements in South Korea and to revolutions and to eventually democratic change. It happened in the US. The expansion of education in the late 50s and early 60s probably contributed to the anti-Vietnam movement. So it's interesting that China has not experienced that. I think that's one thing that I also would never have expected. But education in China has a different set of traditions. It's always more closely tied to the state. I think there's a teacher, Tsai, here, who talks about this in her class, the Keju, the Imperial Civil Service Exam, which is the relationship between education and the state has always been very tight. There's a professor at Harvard, Elizabeth Perry, who's written about this. She describes it as educated acquiescence, that basically in China, education has always been much more in service of the state, and people are less likely to challenge the state as a result. And I think that's something that's interesting to think about. The values are also something that you notice when they do these surveys. This book is about the Gaokao, the highest. I think it's a very useful book if you're thinking about Chinese higher education. These are by economists, one at Stanford, one at UC San Diego. And when they survey about values, they ask people whether work should come first, even if it means less spare time. China is sort of off the charts at 21%. The US is next highest at 6%. There's this very strong tradition of meritocratic values. People believing in meritocracy. 61, Martin King White, a sociologist at Harvard, has studied this, and 61 to 65% of Chinese respondents felt that lack of ability was a major factor in explaining why people remain poor. The US is also pretty high, but nothing like that. And when asked why some people are rich, roughly 70% of Chinese respondents emphasize the importance of talent and ability. Again, there's a deep tradition of this. It goes back to the Imperial Civil Service, but it also is that experience, think of that generation from the 90s. If you worked, you succeeded. That's what Yangtze would tell you. That's what happened to him. And so these values, I think, have contributed to people continuing to having faith in the system, maybe in ways that we wouldn't expect. It was interesting. I would see this a lot in my students. The younger cohort, they tended to be competitive. They tended to be very much focused on their careers. They weren't very political. They rarely talked about politics in class. I taught for 2 years, and I couldn't remember once when a student mentioned the name Xi Jinping in class. They just avoided it. Very different from the 90s when students brought up these political figures all the time. When I taught there one year, when I asked my students to write about their heroes, the most common were all political figures. And nobody wrote about a scientist or an entrepreneur. More than 20 years later, at Sichuan University, I asked the same question in 5 sections, and the most popular choices by far were scientists and entrepreneurs. And out of 65 students, only 9 wrote about Chinese political leaders. 4 Mao Zedong, 3 Deng Xiaoping, 1 Zhou Enlai, and only 1 student chose Xi Jinping, which meant that he was tied with Eminem, Jim Morrison, Lionel Messi, and George Washington. And the student who wrote about George Washington wrote, "The reason why I admire him most is that he gave up his political power voluntarily." So they're more, I always felt like they were very more sophisticated. They knew how to express things in a careful way. So I've also been surveying this younger cohort of students a couple years ago when I surveyed them, and I asked them, what do you worry about the most? It was interesting because out of almost 50 responses, only 3 specified the possibility of war with Taiwan. Only 3 mentioned politics. Only 1 said environmental issues. I think that would be much higher with American students. Almost everybody was talking about personal things. Grad school, jobs. They feel, I mean, part of this is what's the point in worrying about big political questions if you have no control? I think part of it also is they feel this intense competitiveness, something that Chinese call neijuan, involution, a state of excessive competition that leads to diminishing rewards. And I think this is also part of what we've seen from this cohort in the 90s, when this intensely competitive free market environment, those values are very deep. They even went back before that time, but they're even deeper now. I often think about these 2 generations of students together because they're basically, my Fuling students are the same age, their children are basically the same age as the people I taught at Sichuan University. And actually one of my Fuling students had a son at Sichuan University when I was teaching there. And recently I asked, or a couple years ago, I asked the Fuling students, what quality about your child or children makes you most proud, the quality that you most admire? And again, their kids are usually in college or just finishing. One of them wrote, "He has no quality that makes me proud. She shows great interest and talent in studying. He likes eating bitter, and he likes studying, though it is tiring. She is well behaved, and she loves and cares for me a lot. She is not spoiled at all. She's much more capable than my wife and me. She's good at learning new things." So again, you can see like the value of the value they would express as hard work. They're not going to say, he seems really centered. He is, he seems like he's got things in perspective. It's no, he can eat bitter. That's what he's going to need. Another question I asked was, what quality about your child or children bothers you the most or worries you the most? Which of course tended to receive longer answers. He is kind of lazy and doesn't like any kind of sports. I think he is weak. She's not into sports in the slightest. She's overweight. He's always staying at home, never does any sports. I think it will be very hard for him to find a good girlfriend. He is living in his own world. What bothers me most is that she is not interested in finding a boyfriend as we expect. He is too naive and does not know well how to get on with others. He does not drink at all. He has a small circle of friends. He is likely to trust all people around him. He thinks the world is great. He is likely to get cheated. It surprised me all the physical descriptions when I got these, but I was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense because these were like rough and tumble country, like they were small, as I said, but they lived outside. They were like countryside kids, rural kids. I remember a lot of the girls were good basketball players, and their kids have to study, so they're very different, like a different species or something, and they're kind of confused by this. I don't like it. He's a little overweight, But also the world's, like you imagine an American talking about their kid, yeah, I'm worried about him. He doesn't really drink. But for this generation, it was important to be able to drink with your colleagues and with your bosses and so on. But again, this idea that it's a hard world. You've got to be tough. It's not being kind and optimistic, you're going to get taken. You're going to be a sucker. When I asked the younger students, the younger cohort recently, I asked them, do you want to have children eventually? And the majority, when I asked that question, said no. And of the 25 women who responded, it was overwhelmingly no. 19 out of 25, 76% did not want to have children. And this is also something that a lot of surveys are showing this in China, that young people don't. And so this is a huge change and something that China is probably going to be grappling with. And it's interesting, when they wrote about it, they often talked about that intense competition and the pressure. One woman wrote, "We are already a confused generation, and children's upbringing requires long periods of companionship and observation and guidance, which is difficult to ensure in the face of intense social pressure. The future of Chinese society is an adventure, and children do not demand to be born. I am worried that my children are not warriors and are lost in it." So I'd like to stop there and open it up to questions or to Charles. Yeah.
Thank you, Pete. Somehow
And I should mention that Charles and I were sort of colleagues in Beijing many, many years ago. He was actually a real journalist, and I was like a freeloader in his bureau.
I'd like to think of it as I worked with your wife. She and I were colleagues, and she is among the most talented journalists and writers that I've ever worked with. So she's no slouch compared with you. Thank you for the very engaging talk, and really interesting to hear the tour through your relationship with two generations of Chinese. I'm curious, there's another group of Chinese that you have a connection with, which is unlike most foreign correspondents or writers. You actually have a fandom in China. Mm-hmm. Your works have been translated into Chinese, which cannot be said of a lot of other writers. And you have a loyal following, and I'm wondering, what have you taken from that feedback, and has that feedback changed generation to generation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was totally unexpected. I mean, when I wrote Rivertown, I assumed that the people in Fuling would not like the book, because I wrote about like some of the bad things in the town. And I wrote about poverty. I mean, I think at the very first page it said that it had always been a poor part of the country. Because I felt like I couldn't write about it without writing about poverty. It was what shaped the people I taught, and it would shape the city. But I knew the Chinese tended to be very sensitive about this, and so I sort of assumed that nobody was going to want to talk to me again, actually. Now, if it had been published immediately in Chinese, I think the reaction might have been different, but it was not published until more than a decade later. And I think that gap probably made a difference. Again, time moved fast. I talked about that student whose their parents told these stories. And so they like remembering this period, actually. And they often would tell me, you know, it was hard, we didn't record everything. We were too busy, we were under too much pressure. You were a foreigner, you were able to do this. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, we always had a little more space. It wasn't as intense for us. I don't think it ever really changed my writing, but I'm very appreciative of it because you know, I always wanted people there to read it. And it's interesting that young people read. Like, when I give a talk in America, it's all gray heads. And if I give a talk in China, it's all black heads. It's young people, overwhelmingly, you know. So people are, you know, they're reading and care about this. And so I'm very appreciative of it. I think it's, you know, I'd like it to continue, although this recent book has not been published there, and I can't imagine being published there anytime, you know, unless there's a big change.
Hi. What made you go to China in the first place in the Peace Corps, as a Peace Corps volunteer?
Yeah, that's a good question. What made me go to China in the first place? As I said, I had not thought about China at all, but I ended up, so I went to graduate school in England, and I traveled home around the world, like for 6 months, kind of a backpacking trip, and went through Russia, took the train from Moscow to Beijing. And so I did that mostly because it was a cheap way to get to Asia, and I wanted to go to Southeast Asia. I wasn't interested in China, but we landed in Beijing. That was 1994, got off the train. And I just felt like there was an energy there. Like, there was something about it that grabbed me. You could tell that people were dynamic. Things were happening. You could really feel it on the ground, even without any background in China. So that was when I made the decision to try to go back. And I looked in the Peace Corps, and they had a new China program. And I knew the Peace Corps was good because they train you in language, and also because you're there for 2 years. And I thought that was important. I thought 1 year would not be enough. I wanted to be for at least 2 years in one place.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. I teach, and I have a graduate student from China who wrote a paper about the intense pressure on his parents and people like them to get him earlier in his career into the right school so that he could pass the hardest exam. The conditions in the school, he said, were absolutely horrific. But this was demanded of him in order to get into the right university. And it came through from that paper that he hated the system. And I wondered whether you have seen more recently a certain backlash by younger people against this ultra-competitive system.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't, like, I think the average household expenditure on education is like 17% of a household income goes toward education. It's just massive. It's way more than any other country, basically. So it's a huge priority, and sometimes it seems crazy, but when you actually look at the statistics, it does, like, that college does have a big impact on people's future earnings, much more actually than the US. So getting into an elite university in China is more important than getting into elite university in the United States. That's one of the things that those economists I mentioned have really analyzed. So it makes sense. Like, what they're doing is not irrational, but it is exhausting, right? It's a lot of pressure on kids, and that test that they take at the end of high school when they're 18, they're gonna go to college based on the scores from that 2-day test, and that has a huge impact on the rest of their lives. And the other thing you notice in China, the college students work less than they did in high school. It's much less. The outside of class work is about half the number of hours, basically. So it's the high school is really the big experience, the intense time. They tend to back off in college. It's not as important at that point. So yeah, no, I mean, people do complain, but do they back off of it? You see it with the people who can afford to send their kids to the US. Many of them decide to do that. It's easier to game the system in the US if you have money, right? And Chinese are smart enough to do that. But that's not an option for a lot of people. So a lot of people feel trapped. Like, we've got to do this. It's important.
Hey, you said that most people from your cohort became like well-to-do urban middle-class people, and there were some outliers who made a lot more money. Were there any outliers who didn't make it as well in the urban environment?
Yeah, and one thing I should mention is it's probably self-selecting in that I'm not going to hear as much from those people. But I am aware, like, there's one guy that went to jail for corruption, and he doesn't answer my surveys, you know, so. but in general, but I hear from them from their classmates, and I mean, almost all of them stayed in teaching. More than 90% are still teachers, which in itself is amazing, right? If you took a class of American teacher trainees in 1996, like how many would be teaching now? That tells you something about that job. Like people were respected, the salary was good enough, but a lot of it was the intangibles. You get an apartment, your kid often has an advantage getting into better schools. They're satisfied with those jobs. So, but yeah, there have been a few outliers who became very rich. I don't know of anybody who is like I would describe in poverty though. Pretty much all of them, you know, are not in that situation. Although it's interesting, when I ask them to define their social class, very few say they're middle class. The vast majority still say poor, proletariat, some of them would say. So that mindset, there was one guy who was making $80,000 a year. He had 4 apartments, no debt. He had a couple of cars, and he's like, we are poor. You know, it's not poor, right? But it's, again, some of the things don't change. And the mindset, I do find that they still think of themselves in many ways as rural people, as people from this background, because the change has been so dramatic. Yeah.
It seems like you could characterize like the generation that you taught in the 90s as very entrepreneurial and starting new businesses. But it seems like they encourage their kids to be kind of go through the system and take the exam and take kind of more bureaucratic positions. And like looking at the comments that the parents had about their children, it was like at the same time, it seems like they were encouraging their children to be more wise to the world. So how do you like reconcile this kind of more entrepreneurial culture of the parent generation now, but also the system that is like very kind of confined and
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and it's interesting that there's still another big difference in China is that a lot of the elite in elite colleges, people will want to take jobs that are what they call TJ, like inside the system. They want state jobs. Even the very successful students. It's not so common in America. So I think that is true. Like you don't see those kids telling, I mean, the parents wanted, I do know some parents, some students I had whose parents were preparing them if they went into business. It was especially the students from like Zhejiang and the very intense entrepreneurial parts of the country. There was one boy whose parents had like taught him how to drink. Like they would practice drinking. Like here's how you're gonna, you know, we want you to, you're gonna do a bunch of shots tonight and you're gonna have to keep your head together. You know, you're just trained. It's like I train my daughters in endurance running. It's the same thing basically. And so, yeah, so, but it is a big difference. And again, part of how this is tighter, things are more tightly connected to the state, is the goal is often to be part of that state, you know, system. And that's something that I think we often have trouble understanding. But there's a lot of benefits to it. It's often not just money, it's your connections, it's your hukou, your residence permit, the kind of apartment you may get preference to buy, you know, getting your kids into a good school. Those are things that people think about.
Thank you so much, He Wei. I was one of the students, like your student. 1995 to 1990, I studied in university, and my English teacher come from United States.
Okay.
And that is game-changing for me. I just want to say thank you to people like you and all the people that make a critical life change to a lot of people in China. You guys bring a new perspective, which led us make bold decision to come to a country that we cannot speak the language, but 25 years later, we can live a life we can never imagine. So I definitely want to say thank you to you and all the people who devote yourself to become a life-changing for so many people. My question to you is, the period you were in China, the 2 periods, 1996 to 2007 and 2019 to 2021, I can say these are the best period of China, and some people will say the worst period. It's like the tale of the 2 cities. You have the best time, you have the worst time, but there's always silver lining behind the clouds. So if I want to ask you, compare these 2 periods, do you still see hope? What are the things you like most compared to the nowadays China with 30 years China?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways you think about what it was like for a young person. And I do feel like in the 90s, like those kids had suffered poverty. They had suffered from ignorance. You know, they had, but at the same time, the goals were very straightforward. They wanted to become educated, they wanted to become city people, and they wanted to become more prosperous. And those were all possible in that moment. They weren't easy, but there was a path. I think for the young people now, as we see from this kind of quote there, it's hard for them to tell what the goal is. And I can see them, I mean, I'm doing another survey with them now, and I can sort of see them struggling with this question: what do I value? What is it? What do I want out of life? Like, I think they haven't figured that out, and it's much harder. I mean, it's easier because they're not in poverty, they're not desperate. But it's harder because the path is not that clear, and even the goal is not that clear. So I find it hard to predict, what's it gonna be like in 20 years, and what are these young people, what are their values gonna be in 20 years?
Peter, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
And thank you to the Zeidmans, too, for making this possible. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.